This is not a real logical fallacy. I just made it up. But there's a reason for that, because at this point, this might as well be a logical fallacy. The fascist fallacy is when someone attempts to discredit, demonize, or slander an opponent by attempting to associate their beliefs with fascism, even if their opponent's beliefs, ideology, or philosophy has little or nothing in common with fascism itself. Now, we've all heard people argue back and forth on the internet trying to discredit either socialism or capitalism by trying to associate it with fascism. But if you actually talk to economists, they will tell you that fascists are neither exclusively capitalist nor exclusively socialist, but rather practice a hybrid of those two economic systems. For example, fascists do tend to practice market economics, like capitalists. But just like socialists, they are also collectivist, in which corporations and the state are one and the same. They even had a system of wealth redistribution to pay for things such as universal health care, which socialists to this day still support. So when it comes to economics, it doesn't matter if you're a capitalist or a socialist or anti-capitalist or anti-socialist. The fascists practiced both forms of economics, just in different ways. But even if you support something like capitalism or socialism, that doesn't necessarily mean you are on board with mass genocide and concentration camps. Of course, something that is a little bit more universal is animal rights and environmentalism. I know leftists like to pretend that conservatives don't care about the environment, but they do. I know hardcore vegans like to pretend that you can't care about animals and eat meat, but I got some news for you about Angry Mustache Man. In fact, many of the high-ranking officials in the National Socialist Party were themselves either vegetarian or vegan, Now, that doesn't mean being vegetarian or vegan makes you a bad person. And of course, being an environmentalist or loving animals does not mean you want to brutally suppress any political opposition to your own. It just goes to show that even when it comes to something as atrocious as fascism, a broken clock is still right twice a day. But when you really get down to it, being anti-fascist isn't really that much of an ethical flex. If anything, leading by telling people that you're anti-fascist kind of implies that the bar for your ethics is in hell. Look at the people who actually fought the fascists during World War II. The British Empire, the Soviet Union, and the USA. Prior to World War II, Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union systematically starved nearly 2 million Ukrainians during the Holodomor. That's more than double the death toll from the Holocaust. And during World War II, the British Empire under Winston Churchill essentially bled the entire subcontinent of India dry of all of its resources and food. Now granted, he did all this in order to feed the British military, but at the same time, he still starved millions of innocent Indians. On top of all that, Winston Churchill was very clear that he wanted to revitalize the British Empire and bring it back to its glory days of the Victorian era. And if you know anything about what the British Empire did during the Victorian era, you know that's pretty messed up. And that leads us to the United States. Now, compared to the other two at the time, the US wasn't really all that bad. At the same time, we were still actively practicing segregation, and FDR had Japanese Americans thrown into internment camps after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Again, these were Japanese Americans. They were American citizens. Most of them weren't even immigrants. They were born here. Not to mention, much of what Adolf Hitler did in Eastern Europe during the Holocaust was directly inspired by the US's Manifest Destiny. Specifically, the genocides we carried out against indigenous people. Yeah, they made it no secret that they were trying to wipe out as many Eastern Europeans as possible to make living room for Germans. And if you didn't know where they got that idea before, now you do. And one more thing when it comes to racism and the relationship between the US and Germany during World War II. Most of y'all have probably heard the story of how Jesse Owens won gold at the Berlin Olympics, and it pissed Hitler off to the point that he not only refused to shake Jesse Owens' hand, but he assassinated the German athlete that lost to Jesse Owens, getting silver. Yeah, that's a myth. Totally made up. Didn't happen. In an interview, Jesse Owens set the record straight by stating, "Hitler never snubbed me. FDR did." Hitler invited Jesse Owens to a closing banquet for the Olympic ceremonies. When he came back to America, FDR couldn't even be bothered to send him a telegram, and Jesse had to sit at the back of the bus. Even more embarrassing is that Jesse Owens and the German athlete he beat ended up becoming pen pals and really close friends. In fact, Jesse Owens would go on to become his son's godfather. And these two continue to write to each other even after the German athlete joined the German military to go fight in World War II. The two would write to each other until finally the athlete, who clearly I can't remember the name of, was killed in action in Sicily. Now, I didn't bring any of that up to defend fascism, but to set things into perspective. Ethically speaking, neither the Allies nor the USSR had much room to judge the fascists. In many ways, we were just as bad, in some ways even worse. Again, if you have to brag about being anti-fascist, the bar for your ethical standards is in hell. The Soviet Union committed genocides of their own that were often far worse than the Holocaust itself. If Winston Churchill wasn't ousted when the war ended, the British Empire would have gone back to colonizing the rest of the world like they already were. And while the US was in a way heading the right direction, they were still in no position to judge, and in many ways inspired what the fascists did. You can be anti-fascist and still be a piece of shit. Attempting to associate any political opposition to fascism is intellectually lazy and ethically bankrupt.